around that age of 16, now they decide, okay, you're going to go into space and you're going to serve. So, yeah, I mean, what was
term
it
the term they used was, if you can't obey they had a regimen that we did calisthenics, and we had pills that we took, and they changed the formula, and I became allergic to them. And they said, if you can't take these pills, we're going to sell you to the military. That was the term. That was the verbiage. If you're not gonna be able to do this anymore, we're just going to sell you off to the military. You're old enough. And so, in effect, I believe I was sold as a piece of equipment, more of a piece of as property, and then took to behind some box store, and two guys in a van put me in the back of the van and gave me a syringe, a shot, and I lost consciousness, and I woke up on a flight to the back of the moon.
You're listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla, your source for the uncensored truth regarding the human, extraterrestrial, global, and political agenda. Click the like button and subscribe to this channel. And now, here's Dr. Michael Salla.
Well, I'm delighted to welcome Tony Rodrigues to Exopolitics Today. Tony is someone that I've known since 2015, and we did a 5-part series in 2016 at the Mount Shasta conference organized by Rob Potter. And so this is the first time that we've done a one-on-one interview since then. So welcome to the show, Tony. Glad you're here.
Dr. Salla, hello. It's great to see you. And hello, everybody. Happy 2022.
Well, yes, we are in a really amazing year, and I think a lot of people are really looking forward to learning about what's going to be happening with secret space program disclosures, extraterrestrial life, and so forth. And you had a unique experience concerning the secret space programs, because you were recruited for a 20-year period, not directly into the secret space programs, but for a 7-year period, you kind of went through a support services where you did a number of things. So, before we get into the 13 years or so that you spent actually serving in the secret space program, let's talk a little bit about the 7 years, the first 7 years from around the age of 9 or 10, where you were essentially serving as an auxiliary, a part of an auxiliary service, doing so different things. So why don't you kind of walk us through what happened during those first 7 years after you were forcibly recruited in 1991, as I recall, or no, 1981 was it? That's right.
82. So it was the school year of 81, 82. And, when I first spoke to you, I was still developing memories. Like, I was still making sense of it all. And it was still fragmented. Over time, more came and it made sense and it kind of filled in. So I was able to fill out, kind of narrow down dates later on from the original timeline. But it was like April of 82. And but those 7 years were kind of a blessing and a curse. A blessing in the way that I'm not I was able to find places on Earth. Now, after I left Mount Shasta, we did our first 5-part interview. I left that day and caught a plane and went to Seattle and actually drove to the house where I lived for almost 2 years during a 20-year tour in those 7 years when I was taking the first 7. So I had been in Seattle, and it was freaky because it was confirming. You have to confirm it to yourself when you have these memories. It's too unbelievable, even in, when I think about the things, and you have to have some kind of am I going crazy? Is this real? And I went to the house, and it was exactly how I remembered it. And I knew my way around not only the house, but the stores nearby, the gas stations. Those are places that I had all visited. I lived there for 2 years. And the lady that, they owned me, I was privately owned. It wasn't that I was doing support services, it's that I was owned. I was just a hand. And they were in the very first program I was in was an offshoot of Project Grill Flame, which was a CIA remote viewing program. That funding went off and splintered off into us kids. They ran us kids through, and they were using us for, I don't want to say remote viewing, but more so just psychic service. They had found a way to bring us near to death, and they drugged us and brought us to near death. And during that state, they were able to communicate because we had been mind fractured in trauma-based mind control. During that state of mind near to death, they could communicate with I don't know, spirits, whatever. They were channeling, and they were getting intel. So that was the first state. That was my first service that I did. And when I was no longer good for that, I was still privately owned.
Before you move on to that, I just wanted to kind of like clarify something for the audience. So when you went to that first place in Peru, they conditioned you, or they trained you as a psychic. And in your book, Ceres Colony Cavalier, you described that you were trained, they did something to you. And when you went to Peru, they were the people that kind of like got you. Now they owned you, that you were kind of like their slave and to be used. They were commenting about, well, how were you trained? How did you get these psychic abilities? So what was it that they did in terms of this training or this mind splitting to kind of like bring out those psychic abilities that you could then, you went into a trance and you would give them information so that they could know where to go to drop off, pick up drugs, and use for their drug running. Walk us through all that.
So that's a big question. That's a whole show's worth of info, but that's a great question. Really what I was more of a canary in the coal mine for plane shipments of cocaine from Puerto Tahuantinsuyo, Peru to Santa Marta, Colombia. And they had lost a plane. And so after that, they justified the expense. They were leasing me from the person in Seattle that owned me, is how that worked. And they complained because they had to pay a lot of money for me. They said, you better work. When I first got there, you better do what you're supposed to do, or we're going to feed you the piranhas. And, the process began as an MK Ultra process. So I had we had 1970s motorcycle helmets. We were kids. We were suspended in chairs, drugged, with helmets that shocked us from one end to the other. And we watched the same movie over and over again all day. The following day, we'd watch another movie, and the following day, we'd watch the original movie, and it went on for weeks. And at the end of the day, the doctor would take us, each of us, back one by one into his office and debrief us and ask, what did you feel today? Did you feel different than yesterday? He would ask us these questions. And he had stacks of old military issue looking books that was giving him, it was a scientific process. He wasn't making it up as he went along. He was following a cookbook on how to mind fracture us. And then periodically they would take us and torture us. They would put us in cages and electrify it. They would put us in cold water until we wake us up in the middle of the night, make us go out and get in tanks of cold water till we shivered. And a lot of other things that are hard to relive. It was this specific. So in the book that I wrote, and under your guide, the book in 2015, you told me to write the book, and I've been working on it just this long. So 6 years it took me to finally get it out, because talking about it in an interview is a separate experience than writing it down. And I was really reliving it as I began to write these things down, and it was very painful. It still is. But there were several things. We got to a point of sleep deprivation that they were doing to us, and they were programming commands into us. And they would come in every 10 or 15 minutes in the middle of the night and turn on the lights and make us stand up at the end of our bed. And they would come by and either slap us or shock us with a cattle prod thing, and then let us go back to sleep. And then 15 minutes later, the lights would come on. It repeated, and it went on for days. And I really lost all track of time at that point. I lost sense of how many days it went on, because I was essentially always asleep. After a few days of that, you're essentially just, you don't have, I didn't have any, it's all just like a gray, like a dream state, and a lot of the things they did to us were horrific. The very final thing that tested us. So up until that point, and I'm starting to get a headache thinking about it. Honestly, it brings on headaches. Up until that point, I think we were eligible for many different programs, and they were really going for the gold in the psychic program. He called it theta programming. And, it would go down to a different one, whatever they named it, and with a different purpose, and then all the way down, and eventually end up, if you'd washed out of everything, you would just be a sex slave, was what basically vaguely what I remember being told. And what they did was they put us in an oxygen tent, and they had like EKG equipment wired up to us, and they would flood the tent with an inert gas, and we would suffocate. And when we were close to death, a bell would ring, like just your standard hotel bell, ding. It was right next to the cot, the bed we were on, and it would ring, and then oxygen would come back in, and you would wake back up. So you would go near to death, and then wake back up, and it repeated. It went on for I want to say hours and hours and hours, but I don't really know the time that it went on. But it was long enough to where I began to start feeling myself leave my body. Like I would start to lose consciousness, but I would feel it, and not so much go into a dream, but in a very real way, leave my body, and then get woke back up. And it got to the point where it was, it's hard for me to, I've never really described this like this. And so it's hard for me to articulate the words, but it got to the point where there was a great amount of joy. Like I was dying, but I was looking forward to it. And then the bell would ring, and I would wake back up in my body, which was in pain, which was suffering. And I would go back to that. And then I would the process start again. And then I would kind of slowly get to where I was dying, and I could feel the pain go away, and it was joyful. And after a while, as an adult, like an adult voice came out of me, and I yelled at the person, like a nurse that was standing, and I guess the lights flickered and everything. And I said, let this kid die. That's the words I articulated. And then she came over and said, we got one. That was what they needed to pass whatever they were trying to do. And that was the beginning of the theta service. The next day, he let me go to sleep, and he brought me in for the debriefing at his office. He said, I didn't think you'd qualify for theta. And then we went into it shifted, the entire program shifted. The kids that made it went into a remote viewing class, basically. And they let us sleep, and it began to be remote viewing, going to sleep with binaural sounds. They used, and I don't want to guiltily associate them, but they used the techniques of the Monroe Institute back then. This was in 82 or maybe 83. Like I said, I lost but I think it was towards the end of 82. And they had Monroe Institute technology that they brought in. We all had big headphones and stereos, and we were doing the out of body exercise. And he was hiding rocks in the desert, painted rocks. And he would take us out in the desert near the airfield in Inyukurn and say, these 3 or 4 feet mounds. He had little flags on mounds. These are where I'm going to put them. And then we would go in a remote view. We'd go into the out of body state remote view and come back and tell him what mound had the rocks on. And he was grading that, on a scale. And there were a couple kids that were very proficient at it, got it right every time. And I remember that at first I didn't get it. I got the one rock, and then I basically ended up getting 2 of the 3 targets consistently. And it wasn't stellar. He wanted very measurable results. But that's kind of where it went. And then after that, we did a few other exercises. I think I covered some of that in the book. And then we were shipped off to our individual places. We were shipped off individual. I went back to where the man that owned me in Seattle. I was privately owned. I was a industrial grade psychic kid, privately owned. And you think about some of the nefarious things that are going on. You think about somebody that's very competitive in the corporate world or in the government world. You think of somebody that has the ability to just go and put an IV bag in a child and talk to people from the past and the future and get actual intel from should I buy this company? Should I not buy this company? If you think about that kind of stuff, that's very powerful. So
just to kind of like summarize that and to get into the Peru part of your trip, you're taken to Inyukurn after you were involuntarily taken into the program, into this 20-year and back, taken to Inyukurn, and you're put through a kind of psychic training, remote viewing program. And I remember you telling me there was a famous remote viewer that was actually your instructor there at Inyukurn, which is right next to China Lake. That was, as you said, 1982, 83. And so then you're trained and you're shipped off to Peru. And when they want you to access that theta state, you go into a trance and you give them the information, and you're there for what, a couple of years, and you said you felt, you did well enough that they embraced you, and you did, and you were kind of like part of that community. But then that came to an end, and you were shipped back to Seattle. So what brought that to an end?
So I don't definitely know. It was right around puberty, so it might have just been a physiological change. It might have been something that works better in children before puberty. I was also under the direction to not eat sugar. I had a very bland diet when I was there in Peru, and I was not supposed to have any sugar. It was under no circumstances, because for whatever drug they were giving me, they gave me an IV bag, and then that's how the drug was administered when they put me under on the airplane while we were flying. And the guy that was my handler, basically, that was in charge of me, was the only guy that spoke English in the village, so he was stuck with me. His mother really had I guess felt sympathetic to me, and she would come by, and she didn't speak English, but she was a very, very flamboyant person, and she would come by, and she would hug me, and she would bring me lunch, and she would sneak me these sugar like little muffins. They were like a cornbread with sugar in them, and she would bake them, and she would come by when nobody knew and give me a couple of them. And I think that made me sick when they put me under. If I ate those before a flight, I think that the sugar and the drug they were giving me, because I began to get very sick and I wouldn't recover, and I lost effectiveness. So in the beginning, I mean, he was sitting down he had a notepad full of questions from people in the village during most of the flights after they learned how to that it was going to work. And after a while, he said that the whole time I just said gibberish, that it was like I was speaking in tongues, like he couldn't understand what I was saying. So I just lost effectiveness. And that's how, he said that they actually passed the hat, and they wanted to pay for me to stay, that they wanted to adopt me, and the village, they passed the hat, tried to raise money. But then the people that owned me, whoever they were, and he actually, I believe he said the word cabal back in the early 80s, because I asked him several times, who owns me? Who do you work for? What is going on? And I think he said the word cabal. But he said that the number they came back was ridiculous. It was like $1 million that they wanted to, if they was going to stay there. And he said, we raised a few $100 or something, but they didn't make an effort for me to stay. And then I was shipped off to Seattle, back to the house in Seattle. And I was there when I got back. So I had visited the house once before they shipped me to Peru, and this was 2 years later when I got back. It had been remodeled, and they were running foster kids there. There was 5 or 6 other boys that were living in the basement, and I got a room in the basement. And it seemed to be a business for them. The kids came and went, and they were very, very proficient at what they were doing to not get caught at what was going on. And it was a big place.
Yeah, well, this time in Seattle, I think that's going to be very interesting for a lot of people that are maybe familiar with the sex trade in minors, and how they're exploited and used for various purposes, but also for blackmail against politicians. And I know I read a book around 2011, 2012 called The Franklin Cover-Up by John DeCamp. And he talked about Boys Town in Nebraska, where they used a lot of these kids as for basically to put them in compromising position. They trained them to have sex, they did mind control. They kind of did similar things to what you described, and to kind of get politicians compromised. Now, Boys Town in Nebraska, and these kids were being siphoned off or shared, where the elite had their get-togethers, their parties, so that they could, do their stuff and compromise politicians. And in your book, you talk about some of these parties at this place in Seattle. So I'm wondering if there's an overlap, like some of the kids that were used, and you as well, that the part of the goal was to use you guys to entice or entrap politicians so that they're filmed having sex with a minor, and then that politician is owned by the cabal.
So, okay, I don't want to get extremely graphic, and I had a feeling you would get straight to the hard questions, and that is absolutely what was going on. So since we've spoken, so I haven't really spoken to you in a very long time. I've been continually researching my own evidence, and I've had people help me. I've had people that were private investigators volunteer to help me and do research to try to prove, because if I can prove any little shred of this proves a lot of the technology, and it's a kind of a big thing. And I found there have been correlations between the place where I was. They had a garden, like a round stone garden that was built, and Epstein had a property in Arizona that had the same kind of garden built, so you could identify it from the sky. There are many people that are involved. They all seem to have the same kind of homes, very clean, very big and expensive, with many bunk beds in rooms where they keep kids. And you see them for sale from when you look at elite people, their houses that they sell. And then you go in there and Zillow, go, why does this person, there was only him and his wife, why do they have 20 beds in their house? Because they were running these, because it's like an underground, network of where they're running kids, because kids came and went. I never really made friends with the boys that were there because they never stuck around. I stuck around, and I was told that I was the only one I was told to never speak about going to the moon and speak about the base on the moon to those kids, because the rest of the kids were not in a 20-year return career return program like I was. So, but that is exactly right. We were told during the parties, we were drugged and led out to parties, and it was the atmosphere of the party was very hedonistic, and most people didn't participate, but plenty of people did, enough to where they normalized it to be having sex with not only boys that were underage, but girls. And they were on the other side of the field. They had girls there too. But we were told as boys that we always had somebody there that was like a security, that there was a print carpet, and we were to face in a certain direction, because in the distance, and what I mean 100 yards across, it was a big field. In the distance, there were bushes, and we were told that there was a guy with a camera over there. We were to face that direction so that they could get pictures, and we weren't to say anything about it. So that was something that was, me and you started talking about it in 2015. I went on record. I emailed you back and forth, and I told you when I got my memories back, and this is something that nobody else had come forward with back then and made this kind of correlation. This is before Pizzagate, before the Hillary emails, before all that. And I was reluctant, but I was kind of just turned it, I wanted to share everything because I wanted proof, some sort of proof of what I'd been through, so that, I could make sense of it. And it turned out that it really, so many other sources since 2015 have come forward saying that that's the practice, that's what's been going on, and that those parties were, par for the course for this culture that they.
Right. So you were definitely used and abused as part of this, hard to say, call it a support service. I mean, you were used as a slave. I mean, you were initially recruited into the secret space program, but they kind of at 10 years old, 9 years old, I mean, they decided that your skill set wasn't quite what they were looking for, so they put you through these different things. But now you're, you were in Seattle for, I guess, 4 years or something like that. And now,
a couple years, about 13 to 16 is okay. Is my best guess. It's not like they didn't celebrate my birthdays, and but I put it right around the age of 13 till 16.
Okay. So at 16, around that age of 16, now they decide, okay, you're going to go into space and you're going to serve. So, yeah, I mean, what was
term
it
the term they used was, if you can't obey they had a regimen that we did calisthenics, and we had pills that we took, and they changed the formula, and I became allergic to them. And they said, if you can't take these pills, we're going to sell you to the military. That was the term, that was the verbiage. If you're not gonna be able to do this anymore, we're just going to sell you off to the military. You're old enough. And so in effect, I believe I was sold as a piece of equipment, more of a piece of as property, and then took to behind some box store, and two guys in a van put me in the back of the van and gave me a syringe, a shot, and I lost consciousness, and I woke up on a flight to the back of the moon. and then into the space programs after that.
Right, and this is one of the things that maybe people aren't familiar with, is that the secret space programs, that they just incorporated the slavery practices that Nazi Germany had developed during the Second World War, because the Nazis were allied with the Draconians and they were into slavery. And so, the Nazis kind of implemented that policy during the war. And there was this book by Albert Speer called Infiltration. He was Nazi Germany's Minister for Armaments. And he said in the book that in the post-war order that the Nazis planned for, after they thought they were going to win the Second World War, that slavery was going to be implemented on a permanent basis. So it shows that even though they lost the war, enough of them went to Antarctica and just continued the practice, and then took it out into space. And they began practicing slavery in space using people that didn't quite make the mark. So can you kind of walk people through, what was it that decided whether you would end up being a slave with the secret space program or with the Dark Fleet, as opposed to maybe being a normal member of the crew or being an officer?
That is one of the best questions I've had in any interview, I can tell you right now. The reason that I was a shoo-in for slavery was because of the earlier. So when they took me at 10 and I went through the trauma-based mind control and then on to Peru and then on to Seattle, I received no schooling during that time. I had no schooling, no training or whatsoever. So I was basically illiterate or very, very slightly literate. So I didn't have the academics because they tested me. So when I went into first, it was a soldier program. And so I didn't need to be smart at all. I was just a body on a field. And when that program was canceled, they put me into an aptitude test. And during that time, if I was smart enough, they would have put me in command, in a command program. But I wasn't. I just didn't pass the tests. And then I wasn't smart enough to go in and get any kind of communications or negotiations or navigation, any of those jobs. I just didn't qualify for because I was very illiterate, very unschooled, and mind fractured. So I was emotionally not as stable as a person as I am today. Back then, I was very, very, very much so handicapped. So they did aptitude tests, and I qualified for skilled labor. Was where I went, and that's how I ended up, on Ceres, sold off to Ceres Colony. I was not groomed for any of the positions I was. But to answer your question, the other part is how they justify slavery. The Germans had no, and it's unfair to say Germans. I would call them the Deutsch. They identified as the Deutsch culture, Deutsch. And on Ceres Colony, on the planetoid Ceres. So for anybody that doesn't know, it's in between Mars and the asteroid belt. I cover that. My book came out, and there's a lot of information in there. But it was inhabited by breakaway Germans, the Deutsch culture from post-World War II, and they moved in. They justified slavery by believing that the slaves were criminals. So slavery was a punishment for criminals. So if you were, they believed that all the slaves were criminals from Earth or Mars. They had been lied to that the Earth was destroyed. Much of the public thought that the Earth was destroyed. A lot of the military was aware that it wasn't, but even the cadet levels, they were told that and it was a taboo subject. Their culture was very restrictive, and there were things that you weren't allowed to even speak about, and people adhered. They were very heavy-handed when they passed rules like that. But the average person on Ceres Colony believed that the slaves were criminals from either Mars or Earth or somewhere. They thought that you just somehow deserved slavery. And in fact, there were times when I had discussions with members of the ship that I was on that were senior officers, and after they got to know me for a matter of years, that they said that I wasn't like all the other slaves because I was I had more morals than a typical slave, because a lot of the guys, it was like being in prison. The place where I lived, the barracks that I lived in, was much like a prison lifestyle. And the people in there, the men in there, behaved like people that you might find in a prison. So they were targeting for that role. They were targeting, the portion of society that's criminal. And that's another part of my research, is that it turns out with the 13th Amendment in the United States that abolished slavery, it's absolutely perfectly legal to enslave somebody that's been convicted of a crime. They don't say what level of crime. And then there's also a correlation between that and the practice. When you think about it, we have the highest population of prison inmates in the world, in the United States, and they're privately owned prisons. So that, I believe that that's a labor force, that they put people in prison in the United States far more easily than they should. And now they're convicted of a crime. So that has the moral justification to them up there that we're just taking criminals and these guys deserve it. And instead of doing 3 to 5 years in prison, you're doing 23 to 25 years in prison with hard labor in the space colony. That's my theory, and from what I lived through. And I believe that that's kind of how they morally justify it, because it's a horrible practice how do you explain it to your children unless you can take some kind of moral high ground? And I believe that's what they were doing.
So Ceres was one of the home bases used by the Dark Fleet, and they had colonists in our solar system and elsewhere. So did you ever get to visit some of the other Deutsch or German Dark Fleet colonies and spend any time at any of these?
For the most part, no. There were storage facilities out beyond into the Kuiper Belt. So there were giant chunks of ice that they had went in and tunneled out and made storage, like warehouses, facilities. And we would go there quite often. There was a place around Jupiter that wasn't German. It was an ET base. It was a base, and it was a trade, it was accessed for them to access other systems in the galaxy and beyond that were available to do business with. And they would like a bulletin board system. And we would go there quite often, sometimes every day. And they would go there and acquire places to go, because you had to get permission to go to another system and begin and open up negotiation. They wouldn't just cold call and fly into another system. They could get fired upon. And so they would go there and make arrangements to visit and begin trade. And that was the bulk of our missions, were trade missions. So we didn't do a lot. Sometimes we did take people from A to B from places in the solar system. Most of the time we went either to the Kuiper Belt, to the Earth, or to Jupiter and back to Ceres. When we did inner solar system, that was 90% of our trips that we did, moving cargo. And then extrasolar system, and we would do a few trips like that in a day and then go to another star system. And they had a very tight schedule, pretty much every day.
So when you say going to Jupiter, are you talking of one of the moons of Jupiter? You're talking about the upper atmosphere of Jupiter? Exactly where in Jupiter did you go to do the trade as part of this merchant ship that you were serving on?
So there's quite a bit of activity around Jupiter. There were times when we were in orbit around Jupiter. I don't believe that we ever went into the clouds of Jupiter. And there are places there that we were not allowed to go. I know that they did have, they said that they did have representatives that were on Ganymede. They did talk about a large, not a city, but like a large facility on Ganymede that was like a diplomatic place, that they did have diplomatic people there at the time, but our ship was not allowed to go there. We did flybys, and sometimes they would let us, it depended on schedule, but they would say, hey, we're going to do a flyby of a moon. You guys can go to the window and have a look if you like. But for the most part, I just tried to catch up on work during those. But there are several bases, like space stations that are around Jupiter that are hidden in local phenomenon around there. Some that are like vaguely outside of time space, and there were some of those that we went to. There was one that we went to that I believe was an Orion group base. And whenever we went in there, they said that the computation for the computer on the ship couldn't do it, that they had to actually acquire the computation, because they would go in and end up at the wrong time. They'd be in the right place, but in the wrong time. And they would get it, it would be punishable by death. And if they had to come out, was just as complicated. And there were times when we went in and we came out, there was once we came out 16 hours in the past. And so we had to wait before we could go home. And we were, instead of working an 8-hour day, we had to wait another 16 hours. So they took a very slow path back to Ceres from then. Instead of flying as fast as they could, it took 16 hours because they couldn't coexist with themselves before they left, kind of thing. But so there were actually many places that I don't know all the names of the moons around Jupiter, but most of them have some sort, if they're of any mass, any decent mass, then they have some sort of either a ship parked on it or a can parked on it that somebody has set up a shop, because it's a very busy part of our solar system, not only our solar system, but this region of space. It was very busy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting, because I know there are a number of contactees that say that Ganymede is the home base of the Galactic Confederation or some ancient extraterrestrial civilization. So it's very interesting that they wouldn't allow these Dark Fleet ships to land there or engage with that particular moon. Very interesting.
I've heard a lot of it from other people that that had on the show recently, and it's really a good feeling to hear about that stuff, because these are the things that I remembered that are confirmation. Any kind of confirmation is just you know what I mean? It's very gratifying because it can be a very lonely place to be the only person talking about this kind of stuff. And so to hear other people confirming what I remember, and whether or not I've spoken about it, when I remember it, then it's a very, very gratifying thing. So Ganymede, and then I guess there was another race that was absolutely hostile that was on Pluto, that we couldn't go to Pluto, that they were absolutely, and Venus. These were completely off limits. And there were places around Saturn that we did visit quickly. But we were also basically not allowed around Saturn either. So they had diplomats. So there was a very, strict set of borders that we had to obey, that the Ceres colony, the other members of the Dark Fleet, if you want to call it that, other members of Dark Fleet would go there and do business, but the Ceres colony specifically wasn't allowed to go in many places. So a lot of places require, permission before you can go there, even if they're neutral.
Now, I remember you saying that during your time on the Dark Fleet merchant ship that you did some stops in Antarctica. So you want to describe exactly what happened? Where did you go in Antarctica? How long you spent there, and what you saw?
We would go to Antarctica via underwater from somewhere in South America, and that was one of the reasons why it always stood out, because the ship would flex underwater, and it could go underwater very quickly. I don't know exactly how fast it went, but it would make popping sounds, and you could hear it echoing. It would pop, it would flex. And so I was terrified of it. I wanted it to be normal. It was just out of the ordinary for me. So whenever we went to Antarctica, which wasn't very often, once every 3 months, 90 days, twice a year kind of thing, we were able to be inspected. So we were available to be inspected, and then the command crew on the ship could be demoted. They could get in trouble. So we had to clean everything. We had to double time and clean everything and put everything back where it goes, and everything had to be high and tight for us to go to Antarctica, even if they didn't come on board and inspect. And the first couple of visits there, I stood at my post, because they referred to Antarctica as the high command. So when we went there, they were visiting the high command. They were visiting the brass. And there was a couple occasions where we opened the cargo bay doors, and I stood on the cargo bay and I looked out and saw. And I remember the temperature was just around like 50 degrees in there, just under 50 degrees, and you could look up and see the ice. And I don't want to say bright sunlight, but there was lights on in there, so you could see it, and it was quite a distance up. And it looked like grass. Something was growing, like a field of grass that was wet. It was muddy, that led. And then they had a fake, like a military engineered, not a 2-track road, but like from the area where the ship came in, we came out of water and the ship parked. from that area to a set of buildings that were in the distance. They had a road that was engineered, that was military, and there were lots. It looked like it was littered. Like they left a lot of military equipment just littered around, like old vehicles that were left. There were ruins of shacks and things like that they left. It wasn't taken care of where we were. But I remember that they had done the math on how long it would take for the ice. I said, this is obviously not a permanent base. I remember talking to somebody. I said, this is not a permanent situation here. The ice is melting, and because it was warm in there. And they did the math, and it was 300 years or 100 years or something like that until the ice was going to finally, before the heat inside that bubble was going to melt through and the ceiling of the cavern would collapse. They knew, they were aware of it. And they said that they would evacuate before that happened. But I never went into the buildings. I never actually went into the base. I stayed on the ship. And, but it was unimpressive for me at that time. I was very unimpressed, other than the heat, the fact that it was comfortable, that you could be under the ice, and I was in a light jacket and I was comfortable.
Do you remember, or did you know what part of Antarctica this base was located?
No, I sat in on mission briefings, and they did go over that, even though they had the translators turned off most of the time when the navigation was talking. But for the most part, it wasn't under my realm of responsibilities to. I worried about how long it would take to get there. Mm-hmm. I was worried about time frame of how long it was going to take us from one stop to the next. But after what they tended to refer to locations by long numbers, and rather than names, and so I just didn't pay attention at all where we were.
Okay, so basically from the years roughly 1988 to 2001, you went, like every 6 months or so, there was a trip to Antarctica as part of the work or the trade that this Dark Fleet freighter did, and sometimes you got to see inside of the base. Was it always the same location that you went to? Were there other places?
There were
and was it always through South America that you entered, like through some kind of underground tunnel?
There were several. They were usually underwater that we went there. There were other ones. There was another one that was completely dark when we were in it, and you could see the buildings had lights in the distance. It was the same kind of situation, but pretty much the same place. And after the one time that I went out and looked, I really didn't care to look anymore, and I stayed at my post. So there was a real. So the other thing about the slavery there is that they dangled freedom in front of you so that you would work hard. If you work hard enough, they had a very complicated work scoring system, so that if you did well, you could earn. They would give you liberties and other things, and so they always dangled. If you do good enough, it's possible for you to earn your freedom. And so we were very motivated to work. And when we did stops like that, I would keep working at my post for the hopes of earning a little bit more. You know what I mean? Freedom, just more time. I really bought into the fact, even though it was unrealistic, that the harder I worked, I might earn freedom, even though it was probably a lie.
Well, it seems that they had a system very similar to the Roman Empire, because they had a merit-based system, and if you were a slave and you did exceptionally well, you could earn your freedom and then run for high office. I think former slaves were able to achieve very high status in the Roman Empire. So it seems that this was the same model that the German Dark Fleet used for their secret space program.
Absolutely, it absolutely was, and we were told about it all the time, even though it was unrealistic. But I did actually earn, where I was getting paid. I did earn some freedom, and I earned to where I was getting money, very small, like $20 worth of buying power a week. So not nothing to be proud of, but for the position I was in, I was very proud of that. It was a big achievement for me to make that status, when I became cargo engineer.
One of the other places that you say you visited was Diego Garcia. That's a place, in the Indian Ocean, that's very secretive, that is actually leased from the British Navy, that I think it's the US Navy or the Air Force actually leases that base or that island from the British and uses it for all sorts of clandestine activities. And a few people have commented about it being used for the secret space programs, but you also remember visiting Diego Garcia. So why don't you tell us what happened and what do you remember?
We went there quite often, and we picked up cargo. We would drop cargo off, but very little versus what we picked up. So we would drop off a half ton of cargo and we would take 3 tons with us. The reason I remembered it when I got my memories back was, well, I mean, we went there so often, but we made jokes about it that, we're going there to pick up Russian missiles off a Chinese ship at an American air base with an Italian first name and a Spanish second name in the Indian Ocean for some German. Like we kept adding on to that joke, and that was something. And when I remember this, when I was beginning to contact you back in 2015, I really was unaware of what Diego Garcia was, and I went and researched it and found it on Google Earth, and I went, wow, that is exactly how I remember. We would go there in the middle of the night, and there were 2. Now I remember Navy, that they were naval officers. I remember that it was the Navy. So I don't know if it's the Air Force has it there or not, but I remember that we were dealing with U.S. Navy. But there were 2 officers. We had something called a spider. We called it the spider lift or the spider web. And it was a elevator that lowered us down from the ship was hard capped and never could touch a surface. So when it was over land, it had to stay 10 meters above the land. Always they literally couldn't set the ship down. It would always float weightless. And we had something that had 4 cables, 4 sets of 2 cables. And it was a lift that lifted us down onto the surface so we could go down and meet with people. And I would ride the lift at Diego Garcia sometimes and go down and actually meet the personnel there. And when we were there, we were told that, and you're riding the elevator. So it took a minute. It was a shaky thing it was supposed to hold 4 people, but we only did with 3 because when we had 4 people on, it started to really wobble badly. But I was told that they locked the base down, that while our ship was there, that people in the base were in like a lockdown where they couldn't walk around the base. It was a security clearance thing. And when I said that in early interviews in 2016, I had people send me mail. I had people, I was stationed there, you're full of crap. And I had people that called, said I was lying, that they had been on Diego Garcia, and that wasn't the case. And then about 6 months later, I found an article that says that is in fact a common practice, that in the middle of the night there, that they often lock the base down for a classified activity. So that was a kind of correlation. But we would go there. I remember it's the smaller, looks like a parking lot, the smaller area. The ship I was on was about 1,000 feet long, and it would fit. I went back and measured what I remembered, and it kind of checked out. It was supportive information. But I also remember that the pavement was repaired, and quite badly. Like it had expanded. You know how they put the black lines of tar in the pavement? That I remember when I was there, it was like everywhere. It was very badly damaged, they were maintaining it with that black tar. But we went there and picked up, anytime we had to pick up anything military issue or just other things that we would trade. They were also taking things like goods back to Ceres Colony from there. We would pick up, everyday items. I remember one time we took a giant load of boots, military boots that were they were surplus and left over, and we had room for them. So while they were down, we would ride the spider down and meet with the personnel. We had to sign a waiver, we had to sign, say we picked up the cargo. And I remember he said, I didn't go down this time, but what was said was that they had all these boots were left over from a shipment. Do you want them? And we loaded them up, and there was something like 10,000 pairs of boots that we took. We had space, and we took them. So we went there and took quite a bit of cargo from there. There were even missions where we took an LCAC, and the Marine Corps, the big hovercraft, that they modified it. They cut it down the middle, and they cut a section out of it and then welded it back together so it would fit in our cargo hold. And we took one of those so that we could access another species on another planet, on a water planet that was just like the Earth, that it was at the same level of security as they were unaware, that the populace on that planet was unaware of extraterrestrial life, that actually we were the ETs. And so we went there, and we had the ship went down on their ocean, and we took the LCAC in, to do negotiations with them. So that was a mission that I participated in. I always remembered, but that was at Diego Garcia that we picked it up.
Okay, so your experiences verify that the US military had made agreements with the Dark Fleet, that they were allied in terms of technology, and there would be exchanges that in exchange for whatever technology or know-how the US military was getting from the German Dark Fleet, the US would supply all kinds of resources to the Dark Fleet for the colonization of planet.
Yes, absolutely. That was absolutely the case. There were times when we took naval officers with us and they had volunteered to come on the mission and have their memories erased. And during the mission, they were abused by the Germans, that they were, treated very badly, hazed greatly, and just treated bad during the mission because they were going to have their memories erased. So when they put them back, they had no, they wouldn't know it. So it was a very abusive thing that happened. But I remember that happened too, that they would volunteer to go into space for a matter of weeks, a week or so, and then be put back and have their memories erased just so that they could have the experience. And during that time, I remember that the Germans picked on them quite a bit. The Deutsch, the Ceres Colony personnel picked on them.
Well, that's really fascinating that, so we're talking Navy officers that basically thought that they could have an experience on one of these German Dark Fleet craft and find out what's going on out there. But the agreement was to have the mind wipe. And so exactly what was the benefit to them? I mean, would they remember some of the stuff?
None of it.
What was the purpose of that?
They just said that going into it, they couldn't turn it down. I did speak with one on one occasion and said, are you sure, after an incident where he had been, basically embarrassed. And I said, why did you even come up here? And he said, I couldn't turn this down. Could you? Like he asked me, like, you probably volunteered too. He didn't know my circumstance. We said, you probably did too for the same thing. He's like, how could you turn it down? He's like, even though I won't be able to say it, it's like, I'll know that I he had the balls to say yes, kind of thing. He was, he was that kind of an alpha personality. But I think a lot of people have given the choice, and they always make it sound better than it's really going to be when they ask you to come. I think all of these, I think 100% of the programs across the board at the moment of intake kind of promises you, makes it sound better than what you're going to get. So, they think they're going to get a paycheck, or they're going to live long and see, what I mean? It's going to be glamorous. And then they get up there and it turns into hard labor or some miserable condition. But I think everybody, I think a lot of people would take that deal, really.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know there have been a few insiders that have come forward that have talked about military servicemen from the US being conscripted into a kind of like Space Marines or into an auxiliary service that would be used by the Dark Fleet for various battles. So did you ever kind of come across that? What do you know of that?
We moved soldiers on a couple occasions, and there was a huge military action that the Orion group had, and it would have been around 98 to 99 in that time frame, where we were meeting them. We were taking cargo out to the Orion Nebula, basically in the area of the trapezium in the Orion Nebula. And I guess there were hundreds of thousands of ships that had met there and then went into battle, and they were coming back and resupplying at that place. So that was where they had rendezvous. So in the beginning, I didn't see it personally, but officers and people, the people on the ship said that you could look out the window and there was nothing but ships as far as you can see. But after they engaged and it began to be combat missions, that the ships would be actually light years apart, that there'd be hundreds or thousands of ships in the nebula, but they would be light years apart for security reasons. And we would take cargo out, and we had cargo containers that we would drop them off into space, and they would just float in space motionless, and we'd fly away and another ship would come up later and get the cargo. And we ran those missions back and forth. And the command crew, the senior command crew, was excited because they had the opportunity for advancement, because this was like a fringe combat pay. Like they got combat pay, for it. And it was a fringe combat duty. So they were looking to get, if we did well, they had the same carrot and stick thing that we did. It was across the board, that even the people that were high up the command, they had the carrot and stick thing to do well so that they could get promoted as well. But, that was about as far that I got in combat on that ship. The earlier ship that I was on, I think, was in combat situations, and we didn't even know it. We were down below and we had no information. We were just maintenance. In the first 6 to 8 years that I was on Ceres Colony, I was on a ship like that, like a converted submarine. And I believe that ship was in combat many times, and I was just not aware of it.
Mm-hmm. So when the ships that you served on were involved in these combat actions or carrying troops, American troops or troops from other countries, did you ever meet any of them? Did you ever talk to them?
We did. So there was a gymnasium. So off the hangar, where the hangar on Ceres Colony, inside Ceres, there was a giant hangar network that was 15, 20 miles long and full of giant ships. The big ships could come in to a giant airlock and then fly into the hangar, which had oxygen with atmosphere. And there was a gymnasium there. So there was it was a big area, big facility, and there was a gymnasium. And there was a time when I had to make room, and because I was a cargo engineer on the ship, I walked in with the other cargo engineers, and I don't know what their rank was, but I guess the commanding officer of a force of 100 soldiers, and they were a hybrid. They looked like robots, but there was a person in there, and they had an armor on, and their suit, they could sit down and their suit would lock so that they could just sit there idle for hours. Like they didn't need a chair. Their pants would lock in place to where they were at rest. And the guy blew like a dog whistle, and they all stood up, and they were a combat unit. So they were some kind of hybrid soldier that was for a war that was going on somewhere. And because we were a middleman, because we were a cargo ship and we were kind of a middleman, we were not that force. And it was the same as, a French army hiring a Spanish boat to take it to somewhere else where the French couldn't go. And so they put those soldiers on our boat, and we took them to where they were going because we were kind of a neutral name. And we did that. But it wasn't very often. There were other times. There was a organization that is like a corporate organization somewhere in the solar system, and they were known to be very, very dangerous to even have on the ship. And they had like a golden triangle with a red circle inside of it, or around or on the outside of it. I remember the triangle. The triangle was gold, like literally gold on their shoulder. And there was a red circle around the triangle, and they were like a corporate combat unit, or you know what I mean. They were a corporate security unit, something like that, and they actually had rank over the officers of the ship that we were on. And I remember that those guys were on the ship for a matter of a few weeks at one point, and we were ferrying them back and forth. And I was told we were all told not to talk to them because they could kill us on the spot and they wouldn't get in trouble for it. And they were like some very dangerous corporation that was in the solar system. So I don't remember the name of it, but I do remember the insignia.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. Now I know in the book you talk about the shuttle that took you to the moon, and you said on the back of the seat that had the insignia for Douglas Aircraft Company. Now, I mean, that's very interesting to me because I know Douglas Aircraft was very much involved in the US Navy's secret space program in building craft. So what other companies did you ever see or insignia for that we would know of?
The ones that I saw, I didn't take note of. So it's hard to explain for that reason. I do remember, because I kind of fell in love with them, that they had the fire rescue unit on Ceres at the end of the hangar. So that big hangar facility had a fire units every so often. Basically it was a police station and a fire fire unit, but they were using Unimogs that were I believe Mercedes owns that company. Like it's a division of Mercedes that they're like a tractor, but they were Unimogs that were converted to electric. There was no gas power, petrol fuel powered things on Ceres at all. Everything was electrical. So they had been modified to be electric, but they were still these big, impressive, very impressive looking fire rescue things. So that was something that they had there, was a European. I remember seeing some of your information where you talked about Siemens company, and that seems familiar to me, but honestly, I don't have a clear enough memory of those things to really confirm it or deny it. The things that I remember clearly tend to be more emotional memories, not so much, and I think that the deleting the memory wiping process that they did was not just one session, it was several sessions, and they targeted certain parts of the brain to delete. They'd go into a certain part of the brain, like geometrical memories, and delete those, and then they used a different technique to go in and delete things like names. And I think that I remember a lot of things, but I can't remember the names. I'm just really, the names of my coworkers, the names of the streets and the businesses and the ships. I really have a horrible time remembering the names. That's why I'm so impressed by Elena's work, because she's got the names of all the races in her books. Mm-hmm. But when I look at them, they sound very familiar to me, but I still, even when faced with the information, I still can't remember the names. And I know that I knew them at the time. I know that at the time I knew the names. But the Douglas one was that part of the book. I really wanted that to be in the book because that timestamps it, the craft that I was on, because the officer that was my chaperone told me that that company didn't exist anymore. So I found, and then I researched and found that they became McDonnell Douglas. And then I'd asked him if they were going to change the logo, and he said they're never going to waste the money, the resources to change the logo on the seat, even though the company is a different name now. And he actually showed me a piece of paper that was an old logo of Douglas aircraft, and he said that they had been going to the moon for a very long time, because I thought that I had been on a flight along. I said, man, I was on this thing when they started going, and he said, no, we've been doing it much longer than that. So this was in 86, would have been about 86 when I was on that ride. Yeah, right around 86, 87 in there. And so it still said Douglas on the seats, even though I believe it was McDonnell Douglas at that point.
Very, very interesting. And that seat, we're not talking a seat that would be found on a normal commercial airline. This was something that was specific to space travel?
No, it looked like an airplane. So it was much like a 747. It didn't have the screen and it did. I think it might have had the tray that folded down too. The exact. You know what I mean? I think it still had the trays, but that's a vague memory. I just remember, and I had woke up from being drugged at the time. So, I mean, I was like, it was groggy, but I remember seeing Douglas and remembering that I had been on that flight before years prior when we went to a flight to the moon, that I was on a similar craft. And it was just like being on an airplane, except when you look down the rows, instead of 9 or 10 seats wide, it was 20 or 30 seats wide. It went for a long ways. It was a very wide cabin. That's what I remember the most. And then the larger one that went to Mars later had poles so if there was no gravity, you were no gravity that you could grab. There was actually places so often that you could grab something if you were floating above the seats. But that one that I was on to the moon didn't have that.
Okay, so your secret space program service came to an end in 2001 after spending 13 years. Being based at Ceres, and you acquired a lot of memories, or you saw a lot of things, you had a lot of experiences, so you know a bit about how the Dark Fleet operated on Earth and in space. So now, recently we've been getting a lot of information, especially from Elena about the solar system being liberated, and talking about different planets. We're talking about the moon, Mars, even Ceres, and I assume you've probably heard some of these stories. Do any of the stories or the information Elena has released, does any of that kind of jibe with what you recall when you were working with the Dark Fleet?
A lot of the descriptions that I'm hearing Because I've also, after I put my testimony out there and then the way that the public received me, I make a conscious effort to really not study it, because I could, if she says something or some other whistleblower says something and go, oh, I remember that now, then people think that I'm just grafting it onto my story. So I stepped away from I do pay attention. I do follow Exopolitics, and I talk to Elena. I'm very happy that she's been friends with me, and I do talk to her sometime behind the scenes. And a lot of the things she just describes do sound factual, especially Alex Collier and her. You've been talking about Ganymede lately, and JP has been a great whistleblower. I've listened to his information. I'm very impressed with all the information that he said come forward. And he actually connected a dot when he said that everybody goes to sleep when the ship goes to Mars, that it knocked everybody out, because I never could remember the time frame of how long it went. And I went, that is exactly what happened. We went to sleep, when they engaged it. But all the talk about what's going on in Ganymede really just fits with what I remember. I haven't had any kind of red flag or anything from that. The other thing, the political aspect of it, I know that the Ceres Colony was very afraid. The command was very, very afraid of some other extraterrestrial organization coming there and taking over, that it was a very real possibility. And they went through great lengths to try to be anonymous. In other words, when they did trades with other worlds or they interacted with other species, they tried to make it to where they didn't say, hey, we're from Ceres and this is where our planet is. They went through great lengths to be obscure where they were from, because that was something that they were very worried about, another organization coming in and just kind of taking over and replacing their command with their ways, because they're aware that most species out there did not approve of slavery or their mode of their political structure. They did not approve of that. Most of the people out there, they wanted to do business, especially the advanced ones. So the more advanced they were, the less likely they would have slavery. And so they were aware of this, and they went through a lot of trouble to hide their identity and to hide where they were coming from. And actually, in fact, Ceres, they made rules to not put any structures on Ceres, and even observation. Like a lot of planetoids that are out there have some sort of like a tower or a stand where they just have surveillance equipment on the surface of the rock. And Ceres didn't even have that. They went through great lengths to hide even that stuff. So they had eyes to see what was going on around the planet nearby, but they hid it. They went through great lengths. So with what's going on, I mean, my service there was, from the 80s, 86 till, and really it was right around, I picture it was right around 2000. So because I was doing temporal flights, the ship would leave and come back just a few minutes later. It was flying, and I did the math, and after about 6 years of that, it cut off a year and a half of my time of my 20 years. So I was out there for 20 years, but it was really around 2000 that I went and I was returned, because all those temporal flights added up to that time. It was, they are pretty precise about it. I guess there's intergalactic law regarding the 20-year return, that you have to go back at, that particular program that I was in, there was laws that they had to put me back, and they had to obey by that, because that would invoke some sort of other intervention by some other more advanced species that gave them the tech in the first place. Mm-hmm. So, but what I'm hearing, I'm very hopeful. It's very profound news when you're talking about liberation of Ceres Colony and the rest of the solar system. We are seeing things bubble up on the ground here that do support it. The power structure, the funding of the power grid being rebuilt, and you're seeing technologies getting rolled out quick. So we are seeing things that do support that bubble to the surface. But I don't see any red flags, but I also don't have any supporting evidence of current events.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm very glad that you followed my advice and did write the book. I mean, great that you did finish it. I mean, it's taken you 6 years, and obviously very challenging process, dealing with all the emotion, going through all of the incidents. I remember you telling me how difficult it was as you recalling the memory. So, I think it's wonderful that you were finally able to finish it. So, Ceres Colony Cavalier, first of all, what made you choose the title?
So there's a scene in the book. I kind of don't want to give it totally away, but there was a scene in the book where I was branded as Cavalier, and I was punished for it. So that's what stuck out to me. I just remember that was a kind of a pinnacle thing. That was a turning point for me. I was a slave, and I had been through some very terrible things up to that point. And there was a year or so where I didn't feel like I was a slave anymore. Even though I had achieved a lifestyle that was actually, sustainable. Emotionally, on an emotional level, I was not being abused as much as I had been used to, and up to that point. And so as a result, I was branded as Cavalier because I began to joke with people, even superior officers I would talk to in a way that I was maybe as if I was an equal to them. And I felt like I began to feel, like my identity, I began to feel kind of more equal. And there were officers that worked alongside me that didn't want that to be, that they just didn't like me. And the book explains it all, but basically I was found, that was the charge that they brought about me, that I was a slave and I displayed Cavalier tendencies. And so I was punished and reconditioned for that.
Okay.
So that's
well, if people want to find out more about you, Tony, contact you, or I don't know if on your website you offer various services for people. So, anything that you'd like to share with my audience?
Sure. So I do. So coming forward with all this information is, but I did it very cautiously, and I didn't want to take money for anything in the early days, because I just thought that it would make me look like I was a profiteer and I was, susceptible to being bought. And so for many years I didn't. And what happened was it just snowballed. And, we're talking about every Saturday for the last 4 years that I've devoted to speaking about this, or, trying to disclose what happened to me. And it just takes up so much time. I met Jackie Kenner, who is my co-host on my Patreon show, Talks with Tony. And she's a very, she has a lot of business acumen. She's very good at business. And she's the one that kind of talked me into, do this, and it'll cut down, because I just got too much traffic. I couldn't keep up with everybody that wanted to talk to me at one-on-one. And they come in pulses and do the interviews and everything. I just had too much to do, and I was starting to not get back with people. There's people I don't get back with. And so we put a consultation on there, and then I developed a memory course. I've developed some techniques that really help to expand. When I began to get my memories back, I remembered the bullet points, but I know, when you get those things and you got erased memories, I know that I had to brush my teeth. I know that I had to go to the bathroom. I know that I showered, but I couldn't remember those things. And I thought, well, if these memories are real, then I should be able to access those memories too. And so I developed exercises, and it worked. And so I made a memory course. It's, I think it's an hour or 2 hours, and they're just exercises without going through the intrusive and permanent thing of a regression. Like a hypnotic regression is a big deal, more like a surgery. These are just exercises more that would expand on memory. So people that have, and I've been contacted by thousands of people that have fragmented memories of being in the space program or some being abducted. So this technique works to expand on fragmented memories. And that's on my web, TonyRodrigues.com. And that's on there. And then the book and phone consultations. I got to the point where I just couldn't do it all. The book was a lot of work, and I couldn't have done that without Andalera, somebody helping me transcribe it, and Jackie Kenner and Alex Murphy, people that helped me edit the book. And I'm glad it's over with. It was a great deal of work. And there for a while last year, we really saw a lot of people scrubbing our information. We saw, a lot of my interviews. I was coming up on 200 interviews, and more than half of them are off of YouTube now. They got scrubbed off there. So we've really seen an active suppression of not only all the, the local political things, information on the internet, but the secret space program information has been very embattled as well recently. So that's why I went on the Patreon, and I'm happy the book's out there because it's hard to undo the book. It's done very well since it's been released. And there's a lot of things in the book that I never can discuss in an interview because they're personal, just interpersonal relationships that are in the book. So I'm very happy that that's over with, and I kind of feel like I can start to get back to a normal life and work on a second book.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for your courage, Tony, in coming forward and sharing this information. I know it's very difficult. I know the emotions that you felt going through these memory recalls has been very, very challenging. And I remember you telling me, graphically what was going on as you were trying to recall these things, to recall them. But, you did, and now you've made it available to the public. And I think you're going to educate and enlighten people about the system that existed up until recently, and who knows how much of it will survive what we're witnessing now. But definitely, I think the public has to be educated and enlightened about this, and your book is one way to do that. So I applaud you for that, and thank you again for your courage, Tony.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to be here. I will say this, that when you look back historically at all the secrecy, this is how they've gotten away. That secrecy is the main technology. It's the main weapon that they've used to get away with abusing the public, mankind. And speaking about it is basically that's all I got. And I think that putting a light on the secrecy is the best weapon we've got right now. When things are not secret, on a grand enough scale, then we're in a better position to do something about it. But for right now, we just need to let people know. Most people are still very unaware of what goes on and what's happening and what's even possible in with these technologies. So secrecy is the main enemy right now, and letting people know is the first order of business. And then when enough people know, then we'll be able to do something more proactive about what's going on in our backyard. So that's the best step I could do, was just get the book out there. So thankfully, I think I've had some help from up there. I think I've had some help to help me get this far, because there's so many other people have tried to get this far and couldn't. So I think we live in good times.
I'm sure you've had help. So, and very well said.